Hello everybody and welcome to another in Hype's webinar series this year. Today we're going to be focusing on evaluation processes and taking what can be quite a large number of ideas down to relatively few good ones, ensuring that we don't lose quality on the way. So this is part of a topic we've been talking about a little bit around crowdsourcing growing up, being a bit more mature, a bit more rigorous and robust in its processes to make sure that we derive good quality concepts for our innovation funnels. For those of you who haven't listened to one of my webinars before, a brief introduction about myself. I run Hype's consulting group. My focus is really on the people and process side of establishing enterprise innovation management programs. We will do a lot of hands-on work with clients, particularly in terms of coaching, mentoring, innovation managers. We do a lot of talking to senior stakeholders within organizations, helping to explain the dynamics associated with large enterprise innovation management programs, as well as inter-enterprise innovation management programs. We do quite a lot of writing as well, in terms of articles and thought leadership, and more on that in a second. The world that I occupy and my team occupies is this world, which is sustainable enterprise innovation management programs. So just to put that into context for you, the reason that we pick each of these words is very deliberate. One-off innovations are not enough. And for those of you who are practitioners, you'll be aware that it's not particularly difficult to generate ideas, but doing so at a high level of quality in a systematic and sustainable way is more challenging. And so within that theme that we talked today, there's an increasing recognition that we should not be limited in terms of the sources of ideas and insights from just the usual sources. Actually, all kinds of different people can help us innovate. Everybody has a role to play. We have different strengths, but different personality types that can all help build, develop, generate new concepts. But as soon as we go out to an enterprise and beyond, then we do need software. That's where, the background to Hype, we're a software company, and I'll touch more about Hype in a second. But anything that requires an enterprise to engage online using software actually requires some insights into some of the social science. So how is it that people come to share, collaborate, generate content, and actually trust the organization to treat that content respectfully? And we focus on a specific element of this area today, which is evaluation and getting from large amounts of content to a relatively small amount, and the sort of processes we might want to look at and consider in order to make that journey. So a little bit about Hype for those of you who are unfamiliar with Hype Innovation. Our mission is to help simplify innovation for our clients. So what that means in practice is for us to provide you with a good high-quality platform that has good practices built into it, some structures and workflows that have proven to be successful for many organizations over the years, to give you a framework in terms of non-software elements, so people and process structures, templates, in order for you to be able to innovate this yourselves, and for us to be able to guide you towards what we see to be successful strategies. So most of our clients are self-sufficient, but we help guide you towards effective and simplified innovation processes. We were spin out of Daimler back in 2001. We have around 80 employees. They're spread geographically relatively broad, but our main hubs are Germany and also in the United States out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. In terms of what we offer to our clients, and many of you will be clients, so you'll know this already, we obviously have our software platforms that help engage large, diverse groups of people. We have our technical implementation services group who offer the integration piece with your existing infrastructure. And my world is really on the right-hand side, so the process that's embedded within the application. We offer some guidance around that in terms of our product development, but the majority of the time we spend in the bottom right-hand box, which is offering the strategic guidance, the building blocks, the people and process considerations that are crucial in terms of generating sustainable, effective online engagement from your communities, whomever they may be, generating ideas of material value. You may feel that you're part of now what's called the Hype community, which is manifests itself in a number of ways. These webinars are an aspect of the Hype community. We're running one a month at the moment. That's going to continue through next year. We're very happy that the participation engagement in these webinars is so strong. We see it as our responsibility as key stakeholders in the innovation marketplace to help raise awareness on the key things that are going to make your lives and our lives success. And so in order to support that, we do quite a lot of writing of articles. Particularly, I can steer you towards the Hype Innovation blog. There's a lot of great content on there, not just from Hype authors, but also from some close friends of the company, outside experts in various different topics. There's a new blog article out at least once a week, so I think there's currently over 100 articles there, all kinds of different topics, not specifically software related, more people, process, innovation, conversation. You can also look on Innovation Excellence, innovationmanagement.se for Hype written articles, and we also, as Mitch mentioned a moment ago, run in-person events for people to come together, share their experiences through our regional and global forums. So if you're interested in those, just let us know and we'll make sure that you get an invite. The sorts of organizations we work with, for those of you who are new to the Hype family, vary dramatically. So smallest end of the scale, we have clients who are 30 to 40 employees. At the larger end of the scale, we have clients who are in excess of 250,000 employees. And we also support a number of open innovation platforms that are open to the general public. So some of these companies are very, very heavily crowdsourcing focused. Some of the companies are very heavily innovation process focused, so actually taking those ideas through to implementation. And of course, everything in between. Mainly leaning on the clients that have early stage crowdsourcing experience today, because I think those are the experiences that I think are most helpful in terms of raising your awareness on how to do good decision making and what that means in practice. For those of you who are interested in what the analysts think about this sector, please feel free to ask us for any details on the analyst reports in the space. Analysts are now beginning to get interested in innovation management, and so there is some decent contributions to be read if you're interested in these sorts of things. So moving on beyond the introduction, the topics for today. I want to look at decision making, why it's important, and in this theme of crowdsourcing growing up, what does it mean to actually have an established and effective evaluation process that consistently delivers the right types of ideas to your organization, a process that is repeatable and sustainable. So we'll look at why decision making is so important and why it changes when we establish crowdsourcing or online ideation processes. We'll talk about the nature of decision making. What actually does it mean in practice? What is it we're doing? What sort of complicates things? And what makes our processes more challenging? We'll talk about how that then manifests itself in terms of increasing the scale of ideation. And then we'll spend quite a chunk of time on looking at different tools. There are lots and lots of tools out there that help with decision making and choices. I'm going to pick out the three that I see used most commonly within our clients and beyond in terms of ideation. So I'm not necessarily recommending these are the best tools, but I'm going to pick out the ones that I see being used most frequently, because there are many, many tools out there. Many of them are embedded in innovation management platforms, but they need to be used in the right circumstances at the right time. You need to know what their strengths and weaknesses are. So we'll talk about three examples. We'll put them into context in terms of where they fit in terms of an innovation workflow, and then also look at the strengths and weaknesses of those focus three, and perhaps some examples from our clients as well. So I want to introduce you to something called a flood, and this is something that some of you have experienced when we open the conversation of innovation up to our enterprises or beyond. We worry a lot about drowning in ideas. In many cases, the reason this industry even exists in online innovation is a reaction to the flood that is experienced through suggestion boxes of large amounts of ideas being submitted in a very short period of time, and the poor innovation managers being overwhelmed by too much content. History has shown us that when we invest in crowdsourcing or online ideation, whichever terms you prefer, one thing's for sure, you're typically going to generate more content than you had before. It's going to come from more places than before. It's going to be greater in diversity. So you're going to have ideas that are perhaps at very different ends of the scale, submitted in response to the same question or the same topic. And the quality of what you see is going to vary dramatically. So you are going to see some genuinely new things that you hadn't expected from different parts of the organization. That's a big plus for a lot of innovators. The counterpoint to that, though, is you're also going to see some very weak ideas that need to be triaged out quite quickly just to not stifle your overall process. And this is the kind of the nuance of the issue here. We want to be able to make sure we find the best stuff that's out there, but also not have to plow through absolutely everything that's submitted in great detail if it's of poorer quality. There will be some ideas that are submitted that are irrelevant or duplicates what you already have. And I think this is the root of the challenge a lot of companies face. Let's just take a slight sidestep and wonder about why organizations might be tempted to go down the route of crowdsourcing on online ideation. And there's sort of 5 key things that I see asked quite regularly when innovation levels are perhaps not as high as they would like them to be. It's obviously tempting to look deeper into the company for new ideas and new insights. And these 5 phrases you may recognize, and I'll just read them out to you. Our pipeline is full of too many pet projects. There's no real logic to where we're innovating. There's great resonance to why decision making is so important. We don't have a funnel of ideas, we have a pipeline. Everything that goes in gets implemented. And I think organizations that haven't yet gone down the process of crowdsourcing often find themselves in this position. They don't actually have enough choices. And so they're going on the process of generating more ideas to give themselves more choices. And of course what that means is the decision making has to be much more important than perhaps it ever was before, because they've got to weed out quite a lot of content. Many of our decisions are made on gut feel, again, something that we see in a lot of companies of all kinds of different sizes. We've never had enough ideas to worry about managing our pipeline. That's certainly true for a lot of companies, and it's hard to know where to invest when there are so many choices. All of these things seem to add up to a general direction, which is we need to manage our ideas better. If we're interested in crowdsourcing and online ideation, we need to also invest our time and energy into getting the decision-making right. So there's some really strong logic to going to putting an innovation process online, inviting more people to participate in it. It gives you access to rare expertise, perhaps corners of the organization that you didn't know had particular knowledge or interest you can now tap into at the touch of a button. You don't necessarily know what jobs people had before they joined your organization. You also don't know what internal moves have been made. So often people have skills, expertise, even personal interests, which may well have an effect on the sorts of products and services you take to market. Another big plus is the ability to encourage collaboration between those individuals that would never normally meet. So the larger your organization is, the more locations it has geographically, the more cultures it's exposed to, there will be portions of your organization that simply be completely unaware as to what a different division or a different country is actually doing. Putting it online gives that opportunity within reason. It also allows us to find unique insights and ideas that otherwise would have been unused. We often find a lot of stuff sat on a shelf. It's been done over here but not necessarily replicated over there. So great practices that perhaps can be used, amplified and spread across the organization. There is simply no channel to do that. And as this wraps it up, it's to making the most out of the collective expertise of the organization. So all of these things are really sensible, logical reasons as to why organizations are investing in this area. But what I want to talk about is to put into context where the decision-making piece really comes in. So those of you familiar with Hype, you'll be familiar with our standard workflow within our enterprise product. Don't worry too much about the software. I just want to walk you through this workflow and explain to you where we're going to focus today in terms of tools and choosing what sorts of ideas are good. So in the front-end part of the equation, so the front-end innovation, we tend to think about 3 main areas. So strategic areas of innovation, strategic focused areas, essentially groupings and categories of innovation activity that may well manifest itself as ideation campaigns or open themes or brainstorming sessions. There's some sort of categorization which links the strategic ambition of the company to the innovation activity that people see on the ground. Then, in many cases, organizations are moving towards an idea campaign only approach, where they're looking for companies to respond to sponsor-led questions, stimulating the organization, essentially directed innovation around a particular theme or issue. And this is the trend because what we find is this seems to work an awful lot better than the open drop boxes in terms of implementation rates. Ideas generated are much closer to where we need them in the organization. So we have an idea generation phase, and then we have some form of rationalization phase before we move into, say, proof of concepts. So this is where we take the many and we hopefully select a few out of the best ideas that have been submitted. And it's this particular slice that I'd like to think about in quite a lot of detail. And what I want to try and shift people's perception is it doesn't have to be a drinking from a hose kind of situation. We don't have to be drowning in that flood, to quote too many metaphors. What we want is a nice, controllable flow of ideas that's at our behest. We can turn it on and off as and when we need it. One thing's for sure, as we go beyond the normal places that ideas perhaps were generated and owned, sort of R&D, new product development, we will certainly find different perspectives. Some of them will be interesting to us and some of them won't be, and we need to manage both of those things effectively. There'll be lots of good reasons, for example, to test new products with our sales force. We're potentially putting out there 5 new products, reaching out to the sales force and saying, hey, what do you think of those? Really good reason to reach deep into the organization. Equally, think about the rare expertise I mentioned before. We don't know where the knowledge and expertise sits in many cases. So that's all great, but it will come at a cost, and that's the cost we want to manage. Because once we open those gates to more ideas and more content, the way that we make decisions and the process of decision making is much more important. Asking questions will provide more answers than we need. And some of that content that you generate may be outside of what you're expecting and even outside of your knowledge or experience in order to process it. Imagine running a campaign to look for a new product, and you generate a set of ideas, but somebody offers an idea within that campaign about merging with a competitor. Because if you merge with a competitor together, you will be stronger, you'll be able to do something different to the market. Were you expecting that? No. Is it worth consideration? Well, maybe. What we do need to think about is how do we handle those sorts of things that perhaps sit outside of our expectation. Management of the content that you receive is crucial for everybody's benefit. One of the things we see in terms of ratios, implementation ratios, is we probably generate one initiative or project out of about 100 ideas. Now you can change those ratios depending on how specific you make the innovation activity and how adventurous you make it, but just generally speaking, 1 in 100. That means 99 of those submissions need to be managed effectively as to not discourage people from joining in again in the future. So that's a lot of people to keep happy, even if we're not taking their ideas forward. And the reason we need to keep them happy is because even though we might not be taking their ideas forward now, they might be useful in the future. We might want to go back to them. And equally, we want them to participate in future innovation activities as well. We still want them to feel enthusiastic. Let's look at the nature of decision making. What it actually makes decisions difficult. If you can imagine after dinner making a choice between an apple and an orange, it's a relatively straightforward choice. Would you prefer an apple or an orange? There is simply one dimension of choice. What is your preference? You've got 2 products to choose from. They're exactly the same. They're both fruits, apart from the fact one's an apple, one's an orange. It's not a big deal. Generally speaking, the number of choices that you have and the amount of complexity associated with each choice is what makes decision-making more difficult. When it's just an apple and orange, we only have 2 choices, and there's very little complexity associated with which one we choose. But in reality, in business, decision-making gets much more tricky indeed. Let's assume there's just one factor that will affect our decision-making. Let's assume that's return on investment. At one end of the scale, we've got nothing. It delivers us absolutely nothing or even costs us. And at the other end of the scale, we have lots of money. And so any new thing that we generate is going to sit somewhere on that line. And if we have 10 things, we can simply look at which one is going to provide us with the best return on investment. It's nice and straightforward. There's only one dimension in terms of complexity. And even if we have 10 choices, it really doesn't make a difference in terms of our choice. There's only one dimension that's going to win, and that's return on investment. It's nice and straightforward. Well, in reality, there are more things that are important. What about attractiveness to a customer? We're not going to get that return unless someone's prepared to buy it. So that adds an extra dimension to our choice. So previously we had something that was positioned anywhere on a line. Now we have something that may sit anywhere in a box. Again, not so difficult, but getting a little bit more complex. Where do we put our weight? Which is most important? If something's very, very attractive, but we think the individual product return on investment is relatively low, is that better or worse than something that's only appealing to a smaller number of customers, but actually gives us a very good return on investment per product? And again, those things are perfectly reasonable conversations to have and things that we can probably look at in a spreadsheet and begin to get a good answer to. But again, it isn't that simple. What about if there are 3 factors? What about if feasibility comes to the equation? There's no use having something that's really great return and is attractive to a customer if we can't actually put it into practice. And so suddenly we have ideas that may sit anywhere in a queue, and this is only just 3 dimensions. And already it's beginning to feel a little bit more difficult. What if each of those dimensions actually is broken into multiple parts? And this is becoming more realistic. If we write business cases, we may see these sorts of terminology beginning to manifest themselves. So suddenly we have a much more complex conversation. So if we have 10 products to choose from, and each of them have different scores and ranks against each of these factors, that's something that's quite difficult. Just looking at a report isn't going to give you the answers you need. And so this complexity in decision-making is something that really gets quite tricky. Now, the good news is, of course, and you guys, part of the Hype family, will be aware of this, software tools make this kind of thing easy. Software's not good at everything, but in terms of capturing similar information from multiple places and being able to compare and contrast that information, then run reports on it and visualizations and pictures and charts and that kind of stuff, that's what software's quite good at. But the more content we generate, the more complex these decisions are going to become. And remember, we're only looking at complexity here, we're not looking at number. So let's assume that the software will look after the complexity for us, and we need to now think about managing the scale to a certain extent. So even though we have 5 different boxes, they're all brown, they're all different shapes and sizes, we need to find a way of making good decisions. So let's look at what happens when we increase the scale of ideation and generate more content. Essentially, what does the beginning of the flood actually look like? Well, as we said before, we're going to generate more content. Not necessarily lots of content per activity, but in total, we're going to generate lots of content. Think about if you put 5 people in a room and give them 20 minutes to share every idea they have on a particular topic. One of the restrictions we have is that only each individual can only share their submission, their ideas at a time. We can't have everybody talking over each other. We won't be able to hear what they're actually saying. When we put that process online, those 5 people can actually share their content in parallel at the same time. So that increases the opportunity for generating more content. We're also no longer restricted on how many people we put in a room. So whereas previously we might run the brainstorming session to the best 5 people we can find, suddenly we can invite 50 people, or 500, or 5,000, or 50,000 people without any great fear. There's not a lot of transactional cost in that, so it will generate more content. That content will be more diverse in nature because it's coming from a greater number of places in the enterprise. And that, of course, will mean that the quality scale will be variable. There'll be ideas that are really interesting, but a long way away from being complete or rounded concepts. We need to decide if we want to invest time in those. There'll be ideas, as I said earlier, that we don't even know how to assess. They're beyond the scope of what we actually anticipated, but still need investigation. And of course, there'll be poor things or duplicates that actually need to be managed as well. So that's what the beginnings of the flood looks like and feels like. And the impact for that is, as evaluators, as people tasked with the job of actually reviewing that content, that's an increased workload. That's going to slow everything down. The more content you have, the slower they're going to move. And in many cases, that can create some paralysis by analysis. I see this on a semi-regular basis. We've simply got too much stuff to review efficiently. What happens next is you then have slower rates of feedback to the audience. So those people that were participating and submitting ideas 2 weeks ago haven't heard what's happening next because the review team have got so much to do, they simply can't manage it. And what happens if we have slower rates of feedback? Well, time and experience has shown us that actually that means less engagement. So unless we're relatively prompt with our feedback, not necessarily saying exactly what we're going to do, but indicating we've looked at content, these are the next steps we're going to make. Just making sure people feel comfortable that we haven't wasted their time. That kind of activity is crucial to ensuring we maintain and increase our engagement in our program, which of course has a flywheel effect. So let's look at the tools and options that we have. And as I said, what I want to do is think about 3 specific ones. Because tool selection is really important. And I think that we see the failures as well as the successes with regard to tool selection. So what I'm going to do is highlight examples of where these tools have worked and verbally sort of even give you some indications of when perhaps you might not want to use a particular tool as well. You know, a saw is great for cutting wood, but it's absolutely useless at hammering a nail. And you should be thinking about decision-making tools in exactly the same way. What are the strengths of this tool? What are the weaknesses of this tool? What's the likely outcome going to be in order for us to be able to feed the next stage? So the tools that we see most commonly used in ideation and crowdsourcing, first one's crowd opinion. It's used a lot. It's sometimes used in the wrong circumstances, but it's still a very popular tool. So simply asking the crowd what they think are the best ideas. Triaging the content, so essentially removing the poor options from quite a large amount of content. Again, probably an area that is increasing in popularity, but probably a little bit underused in terms of a technique, in my opinion. Some form of expert qualitative assessment, which is usually manifests itself in some kind of scorecard. A group of experts sit in a room, carry out an assessment, rank something out of 5 on multiple different dimensions to create some kind of ranked list of good quality concepts. Of course, business cases, they're a process that organizations use, and in the workflow that I presented before, they typically exist in that concepting piece. We're actually asking for investment. I'm not going to dwell on business cases today, nor am I going to dwell on the next one, which is data analysis, because in my experience, they're so unique to each company that actually there's not an awful lot to learn in terms of exactly how they can be shared between companies. The final one is budget holder decision. And so this is somebody actually looking at a selection of choices and saying, right, we're going to invest here, this is going to be the next step. The 3 I want to focus on are the top 3. So crowd opinion, triage, and expert qualitative assessment. Budget holder decision is kind of straightforward. It requires very little explanation. The other 2 sit a little bit later in the workflow and are very organizational specific, so we're going to put those to one side for today. So let's look at crowd opinion. Again, a very popular tool we use in the crowdsourcing world. And I think that under the theme of crowdsourcing growing up, I think it's also fair to recognize when is crowd opinion good and when is it not so good. I think most organizations will probably understand what crowd opinion is these days if you're beginning to get familiar with online innovation, but essentially it's a very significant part, not necessarily the whole part, but a significant part of the decision making is provided by the participating community. So the aggregate view of the next step is at least steered by the crowd itself. And well, you may ask, well, how does it do that? Well, essentially we ask them to show their preferences. So that could be by means of voting or ranking, commenting on things, trading ideas like shares even, and there are probably other ideas as well in terms of showing preferences. But it's somewhere where we allow the community to offer an aggregate view. And I think in many cases this is very useful. So let's look at those cases in a little bit more detail. First thing it does is it actually triages out some of the weaker ideas. People are not so keen to put their names to ideas that actually really aren't going to be viable or not so interesting or even spurious. So it's used very effectively as a way of reducing the many to a reduced set of ideas. When an audience has a stake in the success of the outcome, this is incredibly helpful. So I used an example earlier about reaching out to sales people, talking to them about, say, 5, 10, 20 new products that potentially we might take to market next year. Which of these 20 do you think are going to be most attractive and drive the greatest revenues for our company? It makes a huge amount of sense to involve our salespeople in that process. They have a vested interest in the outcome of the campaign. It also helps encourage submitters to promote their ideas. So even just by having the crowd opinion be part of the equation, irrespective of the weight we give that crowd opinion, actually helps boost participation. Because I've got to go and convince 2 or 3 of my friends to vote and score and comment on my idea if I want it escalated to a stage where it might actually be assessed and looked at. And the logic here is if you can't convince some of your colleagues that your idea is good and worthy of investment, then why should evaluators who perhaps have very little time to look at content actually spend their time looking at your idea? And I think there's some merit in that. The other area where it's quite useful is to check and balance the opinion of experts. Sometimes a small group of people can come up with something and actually it doesn't fit with what the rest of the world actually think. And so actually putting that out there, making sure that the crowd, perhaps with a wider variety of opinions, actually agrees with them is obviously a useful check and balance. So I think there's some really good reasons why we might use this as a tool. But there are some restrictions, there are some drawbacks, and there are some limitations to crowd opinion. Bear in mind that in larger campaigns, many ideas won't actually be read by the crowd. Actually, you'll find that a good 50% or so may actually be almost ignored in terms of their submission. And why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. If you generate 100 ideas, who has time to read 100? We're competing with the day job here. For people to participate in online innovation programs, they need to understand that they have a day job. They have other things to do. And so we're actually looking for just a fragment of their time to help us out. So they're only going to have time to look at a certain amount of stuff. So in the larger campaigns, they are going to ignore quite a lot of content. Therefore, it won't even get read. Therefore, it's less likely to get promoted to a later stage. The other restriction that we see sometimes in crowd-based opinions is that the more radical ideas, the stuff that actually is beyond what we were expecting or perhaps more complex in nature, may not necessarily be understood by those people that have actually participated. They may not have the relevant knowledge or expertise to be able to build or even rank whether this would come. So you need to consider what type of campaign you're running as to how important the crowd opinion is going to be. Now, I think it has merit in almost all the circumstances as long as you don't necessarily be completely burdened by it. If we generate 1,000, 1,500 ideas, you're going to need some way of getting that content down to something that's more manageable. So let's look at an example from Peugeot, and there's actually a detailed explanation of this story online. If you want to take a look at it, I'll route the link through Mitch. They ran a campaign to around 10,000, actually greater than 10,000 invitees, and 1,300 ideas were submitted in response to that. And this was quite interesting because the campaign questions around new features and functions within Peugeot and Citroen cars, and the employees all drove Peugeot and Citroen cars. So there's a great level of vested interest in the outcomes of this campaign. So therefore, the amount of content that we received was actually pretty large, and actually even more so was the number of comments that we received. Now, if you're an evaluator, it's important to note that actually the comments may well improve and develop upon the ideas that have been submitted. So if an evaluator's got a look at what is 4,300 submissions, that's a hell of a task. So they used the community opinion to actually filter out those 1,300 down to 85 using a capability called community graduation, which those of you who have clients, you'll be familiar with it. Essentially, it's a way of filtering out what the community believes are the best ideas that are available. And out of that, they then went on to an expert scorecard, which actually prioritized 20 ideas for further investigation. But I want to focus on the community piece of that, essentially that reduction phase of getting from 1,300 down to 85. This audience filter took into account a combination of factors. So it looked at a crowd voting score as well as a number of comments and idea received. One thing we find is that the more interesting an idea is, the more other people will react to it. And because social copying plays such a role in terms of online behavior, people tend to gravitate to what other individuals that they know and trust are doing. So if someone else has commented on an idea that they respect, they're more likely to go and look at it themselves. That's not to say we don't get the outliers, those ideas that really nobody else explores, but commenting and the combination with that and the aggregate score was used as a way for Peugeot to filter those ideas down to a much more manageable list. A really effective way of using community opinion. Let's look at triaging. So essentially weeding out the ideas that will never make it helps obviously improve any later stage. And you may recognize that the community opinion process actually is a version of triage. But I want to think about an expert-based triage where a group of experts sit in a room or on the phone and actually decide which ideas they want to put energy and time into in terms of the evaluation process. Assessing ideas with a scorecard actually takes some time into consideration. It also may require some discussion between the evaluation team members. So we need to make sure that the right people are doing that triage And what they're trying to do is reduce the amount of submissions from probably about 50 to 80%. In my experience, you can usually get rid of a good 50 to 80% of your content if you triage well in a very structured way. And this is very useful, particularly in terms of having a large amount of ideas. Again, similar logic to the community opinion. We've got a big range in idea quality. We need to strip out anything that's likely to not make it. We need to make sure that we make good use of the evaluation team members' time, and they're usually very good at sitting in a room discussing the best ideas that are out there, coming up with a ranking for those ideas, and then moving on to the next one. What they don't want to do is spend their time on ideas that could easily be dismissed or going to create debate when actually very few others agree with them. The key thing about triaging is it must consider the comments that have been submitted as well. So remember that Peugeot example, 3,000 comments on 1,300 ideas. So on average, an idea is received around 3 comments. Some of those comments will add value to the idea that's been submitted. Others won't, but we at least need to check. We shouldn't just look at the initial submitted idea. For smaller campaigns, when we're generating maybe 20 to 30 ideas, and we see lots of that kind of activity to sort of small specialist groups, triaging may not be appropriate. All the ideas are actually of pretty good quality, and what we need is a good quality discussion. So this has much more merit in terms of dealing with larger campaigns and less merit in terms of smaller campaigns in general teams. I want to take you through a Pharma example. So this was a campaign where I facilitated the evaluation process. We ran a campaign to around 1,000 people, and generated around 400 ideas. There was no commenting allowed in this particular campaign. I won't go into the details about that, but it was just simple ideas, so again, relatively straightforward to triage. And we did an expert triage where 7 evaluators sat in a room. We looked at every idea, and we simply raised our hands as to whether we wanted to put energy and time into discussing the idea or not. And if we didn't, it was out. Majority vote ruled, and anything that made it through to that shortlist was then taken through an expert evaluation using a scorecard. So you can see actually we're going to layer these 2 examples of 2 different tools together. And the question was very simple. Do you want to discuss and rank this idea? If you don't want to, let's not discuss it. So no discussion was allowed, pure majority vote rules, and the majority vote carried the choice. Reduced quite a lot of ideas down to a relatively small number. Now there is a flaw with this approach that I just touched on a second, so look out for my final tips towards the end of this presentation. I'll pick out what that flaw is, and I'll explain to you a little subtlety that was associated with this particular situation. Let's look at expert qualitative assessments. This is where we're looking at this multi-dimensional based assessment, so some form of scorecard where perhaps it is weighted by different criteria, so certain things are more important than others, usually carried out by nominated experts, but the sponsor said these 5 people have the relevant expertise to assess the content that we've received. It's great at creating a ranked list of good options. So you've got 20, 30, 40 ideas, and you want to know which ones are the best. When actually the complexity level is high, this is the perfect tool for this. We have a discussion perhaps, evaluators talk about the ideas and come up with either a common opinion or individual opinions, and then we create a best aggregate view. In terms of creating a ranked list of good options, there's probably not too many tools that are better than an expert qualitative assessment. You could also look at pairwise voting. That's quite a useful tool in that circumstances as well. But in terms of what's used most commonly, this scorecard approach is pretty popular. So it's useful when we have a manageable set of ideas. You really don't want to be putting 1,000 through a scorecard process. It's going to be incredibly burdensome. The majority of the poor ideas should have been removed already, or it should be a campaign that's only generated a relatively small number of ideas in the first place. The other thing that this is really good at is it gives the ideas a chance to breathe. So if there are a lot of comments there, they're adding potentially quite a lot of value. The evaluators can sit, look at the comments, talk about the comments, work out which ideas actually are now stronger based upon the comments that they've received, or even weaker. Perhaps someone submitted a comment where we no longer feel that an idea is particularly viable, and those comments will actually tease that out. That actually will help get rid of it at triage stage, or maybe requires further discussion through this expert qualitative assessment phase. So too many ideas will make this stage burdensome. It shouldn't be used to push too many good ideas through. It's also worth aware it creates a ranked list of good ideas. So it doesn't necessarily tell you what the final choice will be. That will typically still come at a later stage. But if you want to create a set of options from a set of submissions, this is a good approach to take. One thing to bear in mind, a lot of organizations will put a group of experts in a room to carry out this assessment or in a video conference. There is a flaw again in this this technique, as there is in all, which is it can be dominated by a single view. So a particular individual that has a loud voice, that perhaps is a dominant opinion, they can steer everybody towards their opinion. And as innovators, we need to be aware of this kind of thing. And again, there's a little trick that we've used in order to try and minimize that as an issue, which I'm going to touch on in a second in my final tips. So let's look at an example of this. This is a healthcare organization. They're in a campaign to several invitees, several thousand invitees. You see around 70 submissions, so not a large quantity in comparison to the others that we've seen. That's okay. Quantity actually isn't something that we're typically steering towards, but sometimes it is a natural consequence of crowdsourcing. But in addition to that, 400 comments were received. It's a pretty high ratio of comments to ideas, a lot of stuff to get through still. Went straight to this evaluation process, experts essentially assessing that content and making a short list of 20 ideas, which then would be investigated in terms of what they would actually go ahead and implement. The initial experts triage out actually some of the weaker ideas as well. So this again was another process where we married up a number of different tools to create the outcome that we needed. And that secure list is then being assessed for viability. So again, used to manage a much smaller number of ideas, still used the triage process to make sure there were none that sort of slipped through that were of poorer quality. So just a couple of final things before we draw to a close and summarize. Some key tips here which don't sort of naturally fall out of the other stuff that we talked about. We talked about implementation ratios of getting from 100 down to 1. The quicker you can get that 99 on a shelf, and when I say on the shelf, it sort of implies they're not so good. They may be great ideas. They may just not be right for now or right for our current budget position or whatever. It doesn't mean they're poor, but the quicker we can get from the 100 down to the 1 in the most efficient way, the better. And so think about the process of evaluation going from the many to the few, of getting rid of the 99 ideas that perhaps aren't going to make it. Also bear in mind that in many cases this sort of transition between an idea and an implementation or a next step is somewhat of a myth. What happens typically is you tend to combine ideas, you tend to merge them, they're inspired by ideas to create a set of new initiatives. So 100 ideas doesn't necessarily always equate to one implemented activity. That's just the sort of ratios we see. Sometimes it's much more nuanced than that. So you generate 1,000 ideas and 20 initiatives come out of it. It just really does depend. I touched on a couple of flaws earlier. There's a very useful technique called wildcards, which I use quite a lot. And the way that wildcards work is to allow each evaluation team member a certain number of votes, a certain number of wildcards that they can play throughout whatever your evaluation process is, to make sure that even something that's a little bit wacky, or something that's a little bit more extreme, something that perhaps only they understand, still makes it through to a discussion with the person with the budget. They've been picked as an evaluator, somebody with expertise and knowledge in this space, and so it's important that their opinion is taken into account. In many cases, some of the tools that we talked about already in terms of crowd opinion and then scorecarding may well rule out some of the more radical things. That may not always be what we want. Sometimes it is. But allowing the wildcard process, where even if no one else agrees with you, and you go through that expert triage process and everyone else votes a particular idea out, if you have been assigned as an evaluation team member and you have a wildcard, you can play it if you think that's one of the best, more extreme ideas or more different ideas that you see. So that when we go to the person with the budget and say, here is our best ranked aggregate view of ideas, and here's the more interesting stuff, which may not be quite what you're looking for, but we think you should consider it anyway, it gives us the best of both worlds. It also stops us being dominated by a single voice. So we do have that issue where there is a dominant individual who is pushing their own opinion a little bit too hard. The wildcard process can make sure that we still have a balanced assessment. Bear in mind that evaluation team members are often quite senior, their time is quite precious, we need to make good use out of that time. And so we need to make these processes as efficient as possible. So if you get to the point of wanting to put a group of people in a room to talk about ideas, make sure you've got rid of as much of the poorer, weaker ideas as you possibly can to make good use of their time and energy. Consider whether you actually want a discussion or you just want an independently assessed review and then to aggregate the score. This may be dictated by the types of personalities that you have in the room. It may be the discussion is, your company is very collaborative, very discussion orientated, very focused on making sure it's inclusive, and therefore a discussion is great. It may be that the individuals that need to assess these ideas sit on 5 different continents. If we try and put them in the room, it's never going to happen, or we're going to have to wait such a long time. So actually we might be best having them carry out these assessments individually and then aggregating the outcome. There are different ways about doing these things. There's no sort of single right way, but just bear in mind the strengths and weaknesses of each of those approaches. Sometimes you want a discussion, sometimes you don't. If in doubt, test whatever evaluation approach that you have come to with about 10% of the content. And I did that with the Pharma example. We weren't necessarily sure we had the right approach. You not always are sure. So we pushed through, of those 400, about 40 ideas. We triaged them all, then we did a scorecard on each of them, and we found that the approach worked pretty well, and so we ramped it up for the rest of the content. And I think it's a really good way of just checking and balancing the type of approach you've chosen is turning out the types of ideas you would expect to see at the end. And if it isn't, why isn't it? And shall we make some adjustments to that approach to make sure it's nice and efficient? So just to summarize, before we turn to some questions, don't be frightened of getting lots of new content. It is a natural consequence of going out wider. But the more you plan and the more you think about how you're going to manage that content, the better positioned you will be. There are lots of tools at your disposal. Some of them embedded in tools like Hype. Some of them you can put as a part of the process outside of the software. It doesn't necessarily matter. The point is you get the outcomes that you're looking for. So think about the strengths, weaknesses of each tool. Where possible, potentially combine tools such as a triage and an expert scorecard to give you the best combination of benefits and outcomes to drive out the outcomes you want to see. So as long as you make sure you're using the right tool at the right time and expecting the right kind of outcome, you should be relatively well set. So thank you for listening so far. We now have the question phase, so I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. Feel free to submit them on the right-hand side of the screen in a little question area, and I will take as many as I can within the time that we have available. So just give me 2 seconds to open all that up for myself, and then we will get going. So. Okay, so we have a question here already. Let me see. Will people be disengaged if their idea wasn't reviewed due to crowd opinion? So, interesting point. One of the things that we see is that actually people are prepared to hear that their idea isn't going to be taken forward. But what they're perhaps not prepared for is an idea being promised that it will be reviewed and evaluated and not evaluated and reviewed. So it's about setting expectations. If you're planning to use the community opinion as part of your decision-making process, you need to think about setting the right expectations for everybody, and that is going to be a key part of your decision-making process. That way, we're not going to be letting people down. Okay, let's see what else we have here. So crowd opinion, how do you react to the criticism that crowd opinion will be heavily based on the relatively uninformed opinions and feelings, whereas the best ideas need to be judged in the context of data, knowledge, and how the idea fits with the requirements of the campaign, which may not be stated in the original idea description. It's a really great point. A lot of the data usually comes in the concepting phase, which is where we're actually developing the ideas. So it's about recognizing what type of campaign we have and when the relevant data is going to come in. So, in instance, crowd opinion is going to have a much bigger impact than others. If I'm running a campaign for rare expertise, I'm probably not interested in the crowd opinion at all. It's actually going to have very little merit because, by definition, it's rare expertise. If I'm looking for ideas where we're perhaps looking at a workflow, and everybody that's involved in that workflow is being invited to participate in the campaign, and we're perhaps looking to improve a process, innovate a process, we invite 100 people. Actually, that crowd opinion is going to be interesting to me because everybody has a stake in that workflow. And that's going to be relevant in terms of the outcome. I may not use it to make my decision, but I am interested in just the general tone that the crowd has. So that's another sort of nuance. And then the third example is where the actual crowd will benefit from the outcome themselves. We had a client recently run a campaign on paid time off in the US. And so everybody had an opinion on paid time off. So by definition, the crowd opinion is actually very useful in terms of setting strategy. So you're going to first recognize what type of campaign you've got. Is it suitable for a crowd opinion conversation? Is there something that actually has relevance there? And to what extent should you take that into account? What I would also say, though, is that crowd opinion is pretty useful as a technique to boost engagement, because people will promote their own ideas, they will share them with friends and colleagues, and other people will come in. So even if it's not the predominant decision-making factor, there are supplementary benefits there. Okay, so we have another question here. Let me just move a little bit down. In the case of Peugeot, do they look at the content of the comment, meaning not only the number of comments and idea? Actually, in terms of the formal evaluation they did, but in terms of the community opinion, it was the quantity of comments plus the ranking of the idea, plus probably a couple of other metrics as well, like the amount of visitors. Now, you may say individually none of those things have a material value, but what history has showed us actually is that the ideas that are good tend to generate more of a discussion. So it's part of the way the community opinion actually shortlisted a certain number of ideas. So it was part of the equation. But in terms of the quality of the comment, the crowd opinion had no merit on that whatsoever. It was purely the number plus the ranking score plus a couple of other things in terms of its visitors and its attractiveness in terms of the community. So you may perceive that to be a weakness. I think there's an argument to say it is a flaw in crowd opinion. All tools have flaws. But bear in mind, there's no way you can put 1,300 ideas in front of an evaluation group when they've got 3,000 ideas. So you do need to get rid of a certain portion of them in a sensible way. And so practicality often has a big bearing on these kinds of things as well. Okay, so let me move on to the next question. In my experience, it's quite common for several related ideas to be combined into composite ideas or themes. What do you think about the relevance of this route? For example, themes can be quite broad. Yeah, I think it's something that's pretty common in practical sense. I think I was sort of erring towards that towards the end of my discussion, which is that the reality is there's rarely a single idea to implemented concept transition. It's much more common that a set of ideas are served to inspire a concept. They're combined in part, plus other sources of information as well, so research, legislation information, all kinds of other bits and pieces will then form a concept. And so often multiple ideas and some of their comments will serve to inspire a particular activity. There's an argument to say group ideas into buckets as well, and certainly some of the newer versions of Hype have capabilities moving in that general direction. You'll see more from Hype functionally in that space as well as we progress, where we actually categorize ideas and then look to assess a particular set of categories. That puts more emphasis on the evaluation team to actually interpret what's been said, look at combining the ideas in the right kind of concept. So I think it's absolutely fine as long as you're not trying to do it with too much content. Trying to do it with even 100 ideas is going to be tricky when it comes to grouping ideas into themes. With probably 50 to 30, much more reasonable. Okay, another question here. How is it possible to gather ideas from external stakeholders, clients, providers? Okay, well, that's a pretty broad topic, but I'll give you just a general sense of how that could work. Some organizations, let's look at the easiest situation to start off with. Let's look at third-party partners, so perhaps supply chain members. Those organizations with a vested interest in our success. We're increasingly seeing organizations either establishing online environments for those communities in parallel to their internal environments or extending their internal environments in a secure way to external partners. So that may mean a key IT outsourcer running a campaign with that group of people on the key IT problems that you have at one end of the scale. It could be providing a common question to a whole selection of different third parties, all of which are suppliers to you, but they wouldn't necessarily be collaborating with each other, they'd just be sharing their content with you. In the customer space, There's an increasing trend to involve, say, consumers in the discussion. We're actually developing a couple of really interesting programs in that space, but one you might want to look at is the Fisher-Price Ideas program, which is provided to Mattel. So if you're you have kids and you like Fisher-Price toys, you can go onto the Fisher-Price Ideas website and submit your ideas to help improve or offer new ideas for Fisher-Price toys. So this is another way of getting people involved. There's multiple parts to that, to the answers to that question, I'm afraid, but that's just at a high level. We do support a number of organizations in this kind of way. Which kind of be, just going to move on a little bit, see if I've got time for one quick question. Let me just find something that's appropriate. Okay. Crowd opinion, is it essentially a way to triage content? Is there any reason not to do or to do both crowd opinion and the expert triage in combination? So to build on what I said earlier, I think crowd opinion is always helpful in terms of promoting more participation and engagement, even if you don't use the opinion. You can, as long as you're setting the relevant expectations, perhaps you might want to say those ideas that are nominated by the crowd will be evaluated first or maybe considered with greatest preference, but you don't exclude assessing other ideas as well. The expert triage, to be honest, I always do that whenever I can, unless we've literally had 20 ideas, in which case they're probably all of relatively high quality. The expert triage is so quick and such an efficiency improvement in terms of getting rid of some of the poorer ideas. It's a good practice to go through. I'm awfully sorry, but we're coming up to the end of time. I'm aware there are a number of questions I haven't had time to answer, so apologies for that. What I will do is I will ask Mitch to send these to me, and then I will respond to the individuals asked those questions in person, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. So I'm going to hand back to Mitch, and thank everybody for their time and energy today. It's a really great discussion.